This is a video on statistical control charts, or you may refer to them simply as a control chart. We've talked a little bit about control charts before. There's multiple kinds of control charts. The OpEx textbook offers what it calls a route map for selecting the appropriate type of control chart. You can see if you're looking at counts of data, a U chart or a Laney U chart. If you're looking at attribute data, in other words, discrete data, if you want to do a chart that shows proportions or percentages in a P chart or a Laney P chart. If the data is individuals or counts of individuals or in subgroups, it's called an individuals chart or an I chart or an X bar chart. This I-MR stands for individuals and moving range. X bar and R, it's a X bar and range, and this is X bar and S for standard deviation. We'll talk more about what those represent as we go forward. So here's an example of a control chart that you've seen before. This is a chart from some of the Statipult data generated by Team 2. It shows the average distance shot for each of the balls. The distance is on the Y vertical axis, and then the progression, shot 1, 2, 3, 4 is on the X axis. So in addition to showing the values over time, a control chart also has additional features. One, it will plot the average for this range of data. So you can see each individual shot's value, and then the overall average was 77.77 inches. And there's other features, including the upper control limit and a lower control limit. The upper and lower control limits, those are statistical calculations based on the data. What they represent is the expected range of values from this process. If you have a stable process, then those upper and lower control limits can help you determine whether or not your process is staying in control, going out of control, or has these statistical outliers. Just because there's an upper and lower control limit, that doesn't mean that the process is meeting the customer's expectations or that the process can't change. It's a calculation that Minitab is making based on the existing data. Minitab obviously has no idea what kinds of actual process controls you have in place that would keep the results within a consistent range. So Minitab applies statistical tests to this data, and there's this red box with a 1 next to it indicates that these data points have violated one of those statistical tests. Specifically, they fall outside of the control limits. And these control limits are set at plus and minus 3 standard deviations from the mean. So we'd expect to see something like 99%, it's 99.7% of the data falling within plus or minus 3 standard deviations in a normal distribution. So it's highly unlikely that this process would generate data that would fall outside of those control limits unless there's some unusual activity happening. And so you can use these flags here on these statistical outliers to indicate there may be special cause variation. We talked about the how you determine whether or not there's special cause variation in your process. So we see for the rest of this, what seems to be some normal variation. There's some data points kind of going all in one direction for a little period here, but statistically speaking, all this falls within an expected range. So these outliers are data points where if you were doing an improvement project or trying to determine what's happening in a process, you might investigate, because those seem to be indicators of special cause variation. I've added here the specification limits again. So the target was 80 inches, but plus or minus 3 inches was acceptable. That's what the customer requirements were. You can see there's lots of data points that fall outside of those customer requirements. So again, just because you have a process that's in statistical control doesn't mean you're meeting customer requirements. So now we're going to take a look at some data and create control charts in Minitab. So I'm going to open data file. I'm going to go to the SPC IMR chart. And so this data represents bag weights in kilograms. You can see there's 30 rows of data. You can see that each value seems to be fairly unique. But those kind of range of data. So I'm going to do a couple of things. First, I'm just going to create a time series chart. You don't have to know how to do this. It's somewhat useful. But my point here is just to show you what a time series chart without any of those special statistical features looks like. So this just plots the individual values over time. It's useful in the sense that you can see there's a fair amount of variation here. It looks like there were some wild swings in the bag weights kind of in the middle of this sample, but it doesn't tell you a whole lot else specifically. You create a control chart though, and go to stat, control charts, and I'm just going to go to variables charts for individuals, and I'm just going to go to individuals chart. Just go to this. The bag weights are the variables we want to show. Click on OK. And there we have the control chart. This is an I chart, I standing for individuals. So you can see the individual values, and when you're in Minitab and you hover, you can see what those are. The average for these 30, the sample of 30 bag weights, the average is 30.98 kilograms. You can see based on the data, Minitab is predicting that 99+% of the values will fall between 35.6 and 26.4 kilograms. So this seems to be a process that's in control. Whether or not it's meeting customer specifications is a completely different matter. You can, if you want to, change some of the defaults. So if you wanted to make a chart that was more sensitive, and maybe you didn't want to use the default of 3 standard deviations, you could change that to 2 standard deviations. And so we have the default, the 3 standard deviations here, we have 2 standard deviations. Again, all these data points seem to fall more or less within plus or minus 2 standard deviations. You can also add features. If I wanted to add a reference line, like maybe there was a target of 35. There's my target, whatever value that has. Okay, I'm not going to save those changes. But we see here is a process that's fairly in control. If we want to, let's see. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Here are the tests. So on the button for iChart options, you can see the various tests that are in play. So this first data point, 1 point greater than K standard deviations in the center line, that's that test for data points that are more than 3 standard deviations away from the center line. So if you wanted to add in some tests to look for statistically unlikely things, like having 9 points in a row on the same side of the center line. So we had 9 points in a row, all above the average. That's statistically unlikely. And you can see the default values in here. Most of these are turned off. By default, Minitab leaves that first rule turned on. All right, so there's basic control chart. Fairly useful, gives you some basic information about whether or not there are any statistical outliers and whether or not the process is in control.